Well, hey, everybody, it's Pastor Martin. Grateful that you joined me for just a few minutes tonight. And I pray and trust that everyone had a good day today, that you had a good service. We had an awesome service today and want to just a good service. Well, I want to I just came up for a few minutes to sort of quiz you, I guess, or quiz you. Let's talk about the ATL. Everyone talks about the ATL, and of course, this is Black History Month, and there's been a lot of history that have been made in the ATL. There's a lot of history that has been made, and so I want to talk about do you know your history for the ATL? Do you know about um, the history? Many of us that have lived here all of our lives. There's some of you, I know you come from other places. You moved to Atlanta, maybe from Michigan, maybe from California or Texas or wherever. But I was born and raised in Atlanta. Born and raised here, born in 1960, and I've lived here all my life. I've traveled the world, but I've lived in Atlanta all my life. And so there's a history that goes with this. And so I want to share with you some of the things, and I made a couple of notes just to jot down the things we can talk about. Maybe some of you may be familiar with it if you checked it out and look back in the historical things you can see. But even when it comes to the things of the political world, we see the political landscape today. And as we go back years ago, when I was a little boy coming up, I think his name was Lester Maddox. He was if I'm not sure, I think he was the mayor, the governor, or something in Georgia. But a very time during that time of segregation and other things. And then we start seeing the landscape change politically in the ATL. Now we've got, of course, Alicia. Alicia, what I can't even think of her name or pronounce her name right now. I'm getting tongue tied. You know I'm talking about, the mayor of Atlanta, and she's a black lady. Of course, we've had the other mayors that have been, but the first black mayor that was here, of course, and that was elected that we all remember was Maynard Jackson, and he had two terms as mayor. He served and then served again. Then he went out and was out for many years, and then he ran again and won again. And so he was the first black mayor of Atlanta. He was the one that really, when you start thinking about a lot of things that were accomplished from and in the city of Atlanta, in the ATL, Maynard Jackson had a lot to do with that during the day and during the time. And so you find that those that, if you were here, if you were not here, if you were not born, if you did not study that, you may not know that, and you may think that Andrew Young and different ones, they made great impacts, but Maynard Jackson was one of the most popular mayors of color in the city of Atlanta, especially among us. And so that was a great thing in the political world. Of course, we've seen great things happen since then with all of those things. And I'm talking about Black History Month, so we're talking about the strides. We're talking about the great advancements that we've made even in the political world, in the city, and then in other surrounding areas. You made great political things where you have the DA, Paul Howard, that has been the DA forever. Those type of things. And so years ago when I was born, those we didn't see that. That was not a part of the makeup. That was not a part of the ATL. That was not a part of things that we did during that time. And then when you think about the landmarks, there's some of you that if you're not born here, you may not know that over the years there's been drastic change as far as the landmarks of this city. There are many of us that grew up, we will remember that when we grew up on Sundays, they had what they call gospel musicals, what we call musicals today. They were actually called something else during the day. And I remember on Sundays, the late Esmond Patterson, and during that time it was WAOK and YEZ and different ones, and they would have these programs on Sunday. They would bring in groups that we know are people that we feel and came to love and know that are popular. They brought in people such as Shirley Caesar came in. They had the Five Blind Boys of Alabama. You had the Mighty Clouds of Joy, the Swanee Quintet. What was it? And some others, the Violent Airs, different ones that came in to sing on these programs. And during that day, this is the landmark that you wouldn't know if you were not here. You wouldn't remember it because it's no longer there. It was downtown, right down the street from the Capitol, and it was called the City Auditorium. At the City Auditorium, they held many events during that day. They had wrestling at the City Auditorium, and especially the things on Sundays. They had singings on Sundays at the City Auditorium, and the doors would open at 3 o'clock. And you could go in, you would purchase your ticket, you could go in, and the seating was open. You didn't have any VIP seating. You could sit on the front row, and I remember going many days where my grandmother would take us. We would sit on the front row. We'd be there when the doors opened at 3, and most of the time the event started sometimes at 6 o'clock, and they would have different ones. And during that day, the most popular person that did things was Edmund Patterson. He was the premier radio announcer in that day, and then also his wife, and then there were several others that came along. But it was a thing that was a landmark. Now, I if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Georgia State that bought it, and it's something totally different. When you go past there, if you were not here during that day, you would never know that was the City Auditorium where many major events took place. I remember my late uncle, Evangelist Gene Martin, brought during that time when he had first hit with Oh Happy Day. He brought to the City Auditorium Edwin Hawkins, and they performed there. And so the City Auditorium was a big place where you would go for different events and different things. And so it was. If you were born here, you would know that the City Auditorium was a big, big thing. It was a landmark in this city. And since then, of course, several years ago, it was purchased, so that's no longer there. But just to know the history of the ATL. Then we had other landmarks. Of course, you had the stadium that they took down many years ago, but they still have the area where it was called Fulton County Stadium, where they still house in I think it's the green lot. They use it sometimes for people going to court. That's where you park at, and they use that for parking, but there's still a thing over in the corner that says this is the spot where Hank Aaron hit his 715th home run to pass Babe Ruth. And so those landmarks are no longer here. The stadium is no longer here. That part is still here. And so there are different areas, and there may be somebody watching that can even help in some areas some things that I probably don't remember. But those were landmarks in the city. Another landmark that is no longer there, most of us that have been here years, now we go and we have dinners and what they call banquets and everything at all other places today where we get served at, we go in at different hotels or whatever and go in. But one of the most popular places back in the day, when I was born, we're talking from the 60s up to now, one of the most popular landmarks for eating was Pascal Brothers. It was not only a restaurant, but it was a hotel. And many of our black major events took place there. Many things of strategy, meetings to strategize were held at Pascal Brothers. And I remember many banquets and dinners that we had there. It was black owned, and that was a great thing that we had doing back in the 70s and 80s at Pascal Brothers. Of course, that, I don't know if they tore that particular spot down. It's still on ML King, I think, but down the street, further down the street, you'll find there down from the stadium, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, you will find that Pascal Brothers, they relocated, and they relocated from that place. And so we understand that if you know the history of this city, and we have come a long ways. Everyone ate at Pascal's. Everyone, that was the place to eat. And then there were other places that we would eat, restaurants, and somebody, you may be able to, help and say something. I don't know if I'm pulling up the things here, but they did a lot of things, a lot of places that we would eat. We had, I don't know, was it called Busy Bee or something, and other places that were popular places to eat that you would go, and rib places and Anderson's Barbecue. They are no longer there. Just a whole lot of places we would go and eat and enjoy. And so we understand that the ATL has a great history. Some things have changed, and when you go in certain places and see it, you'll be like, I didn't know. We look at the Hunter Street Baptist Church, and we West Hunter Street Baptist Church, that we used to have many of our meetings at. They moved to a bigger building, bigger church, but for years they were on the corner there and ML King, right down from ITC, right down from the colleges. They were down from that area. And I don't know if that church, I don't even know if that building is still there. I know one time some churches were there. They may have closed that down. But over the years, these things have changed. And so we've seen the history. We've seen the history of things that have changed. We've seen the history of things that have come about. And so one of the things I think when we start talking about the ATL, we have to somewhat let our children know and others know that there is a great history when it comes to these various things. There's a great history. We think about it, there's great history. And so there are landmarks and different things in the city that have taken place. And there are things that are no longer there, but when you pass by, you say, I remember what used to be there or what was there, because there's great history in this city, in the ATL. And so I'm just asking, how well do you know your history? If you move from another place, you may know some things, you may not know some things, but there's great history here. When you think of schools in the city, the history of our schools, there were, of course, we had some of the major black colleges. They were talking about, I think, Marsh Brown the other day on the news, and they were saying that they're still functioning. Even though they had lost their accreditation a while back, they're still functioning. They've got 3 buildings that they operate, and they have about 35 students or whatever. But the thing is, back in the day, Marsh Brown, you had Morehouse, and you had the other ones that came along, Spelman, and these were some of the major colleges that were on ML King, right in that area, and you could go, and we had many that came from those schools, historical black schools and colleges, and so that was the history. Now, when you see it, we've got other colleges and other things, but for the ATL, those were major players when it came to college. When it came to college situations, they were major players, and so we think of them in terms of colleges and schools and those things, and just to think back on it again, some of our major voices in the 60s and 70s and 80s came from these colleges. And so there's a great history. And when you understand that, when you know that, talking about the ATL and talking about Morehouse, talking about Spelman, talking about Marsh Brown and those areas, you have to mention those because they were great schools, colleges. Then when it came to high school, back in the day, you had schools that are no longer functioning and are no longer there. You had Howard, you had Washington High, which is one of the oldest schools in the city. I went to Washington, Booker T. Washington there on ML King, Washington High School. Then you had Archer High. My mother and father and uncle graduated from Archer High. Then you had South Fulton. You had Grady. You had, what's the other one? Douglas High School. And you could go on. In elementary schools, you had different ones. I went to M. Agnes Jones and W.H. Scott, I believe it is. And so there's a whole lot of history even in our schools. Again, some of them are no longer functioning. Some of them have taken on different roles. But when you look back, those of us that were here, that lived here, we took great pride, if you want to say, in our college, in our schools, in our local schools, in our high schools and elementary schools. That was the thing of our day, and was really something that we pushed. It was something before a lot of the changes. When we went to school, of course, historically, it was only elementary, and you went from elementary to high school. From the first grade, kindergarten to seventh grade was elementary school, and then when you went into high school, it was the 8th grade through the 12th grade. And, you were sub-freshmen, freshmen, sophomores, and then seniors. And so we understood that history. And then later on, they changed it where they put in middle school. And, of course, that changed the whole narrative of it again. But many people, if you were not here and didn't know the history, you would think that middle school has always been, but it has not been. We were in elementary from kindergarten until up until the 7th grade, and then we went to, of course, 8th through 12th grade. And then you've got colleges. And so those were the schools and the colleges, and then the landmarks. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the great churches, gatekeepers of the city back in the day. We're talking about the 60s through, up to now. But the gatekeepers, before we got to the names that we have now, and people that are present now, people that are here now, we had great gatekeepers back in the day. And when you talk about going back into the 60s, we're talking about early on. We're talking about great denominations and movements, and those that started back in that day that have come up to this place. And many of them, they may still be in existence. Some of them are not. You may not know their names, but in the city, they were great. And they were churches and gatekeepers of the city before social media. They were gatekeepers of the city before TV. Many of them may have done radio, but they were great gatekeepers of the ATL. When you think of those that were gatekeepers, we think of people, for instance, one of the gatekeepers of the city. He's older now, older, but one of the great gatekeepers of the city when I was coming up in the 60s and 70s was Pastor Jasper Williams. Oh my God, you would hear him, and we would tune into him on the radio. He would come on, I don't know if it was AOK or those stations, but he had many albums, and I should have brought one in here. Before we do all these things, we have CDs now, but he had actual albums or records that he would record his messages and preach his messages, and those things were recorded and put out there. So he was a great keeper. Salem Baptist Church, great gatekeeper. Then we had people like Pastor Stafford that was out in the Decatur area, basically out, I think that's out there in Decatur down from the mall, and I can't remember, Free Fall, I believe that was the name of his church. I believe it was a Free Fall church. And so we saw and we understood that he was a great gatekeeper in the city. And we saw that, and we understood that he was a great gatekeeper in that time as a pastor in the city. And so we start seeing that during those days, we had those, of course, again, I'd say before social media, before social media became popular, we start seeing these great gatekeepers. You had the late Bishop Quincy Caldwell that pastored Tabernacle, that many things probably didn't move unless they went through Tabernacle. And then you had others that were gatekeepers. You had the late Bishop M.D. Spires, the Church of Atlanta Lighthouse, great gatekeeper back in the 60s and 70s, well, especially the 70s and 80s. Pastor Spires brought so many great people that we've heard over the years as far as preachers came into Lighthouse. If you came to Lighthouse, oh my God, you were in pocket. We heard great, great preachers. I remember he was, along with Mother Louise Reese, the mother of Mother Nancy Hall Reese, Reese Hall. I remember them bringing the late Apostle Richard D. Hinton to Atlanta at the old lighthouse, the lighthouse that they have now where Pastor McKibben's pastors. Of course, they were on the other lighthouses on Whitehall, and we had some great meetings there, and they brought the late Richard Hinton. They brought people in. We heard great preachers and many people that maybe have gone on, Bishop Richard Carr and different ones, Evangelist Maria Gardner, Evangelist Ernestine Cleveland Reeves. All of these people I was introduced to at Church of Atlanta Lighthouse under the late Bishop M.D. Spires. So he was a great gatekeeper in the city. And there are many, many others that I may not know or mention here tonight, but they were great gatekeepers in the city. When I mean gatekeepers, when you came in, that was the place, or those were the names that were mentioned in the city. You had my late brother-in-law. You had Powerhouse back in the 80s and 90s was a gatekeeper. When you came, the colleges and students came to Powerhouse. Our church was filled up with college students, and then we would feed them. But he had a great choir, the Voices of Power, and just a gatekeeper in the city. And then you think of the different ones that just came. You think of Cathedral of Faith. When you think of that, you think of the late Bishop Jonathan Greer, Cathedral of Faith, the Showers of Blessing. But then you can go back further than that, because another gatekeeper of the city, when I was a young man, when I was a little boy, never forget the church sit up on a hill. He was a great gatekeeper, and that was the late Bishop George Briley. He was Elder Briley during the time, but he had a great choir. They came on the radio. My aunt, we call her Mama Rose, and Mother Reese sung in the choir together, and that was great. I mean, you talking about great stuff. It was, they were gatekeepers, and those churches, when you want to have church on Sunday night, when you wanted to have church, I know we don't have church much on Sundays, but if you want to have church on Sunday night, you would go to Jones Avenue, Church of God in Christ, and we would have church. I mean, they would have old-fashioned stump-down church. They had full choir. They had everything. Bishop Briley would preach, and then they moved to where the church is now on Avon, and he became Bishop Briley. So when you think of the history and some of the gatekeepers and people that were a great part of ministry as we go back into, and I think that sometimes we sort of forget, and we see all the things that are going on now, the social media push and everything, and all that's wonderful, all that's good, but you got to remember that this city, the ATL has a great history when it comes down to the things that are happening. And so church-wise, we have a great history in the ATL. There's some things that happened. There were some great things that were accomplished here. You talk about Ebenezer. You talk about, and I guess the list could go on and on and on and on of things and people that have been here that we could talk about the history of this great city. And when it comes to church, I'm telling you, oh my God, there were places years ago when you went not just for church, but you went to experience a move of God, and God was moving. There were great gatekeepers. We talk about, I could go on and talk about churches. I could talk about restaurants on the late night. I don't even know if they stay open anymore. I know they're still here. I don't know if they stay open late like they used to. The Beautiful Restaurant. Oh my God, we could we could talk about the Beautiful Restaurant and go to the Beautiful, and they were 24 hours, and you could go and just eat and get some good food. Historical places, historical things that we remember and different things like that. I talked about the other week when I talked about history. As we go back to the landmark part, those when you go out now, I think it's a movie where they do movies at some movie sets and stuff built out there. But those of us that were born here remember before there was Six Flags, before there was an amusement park that was stable, we used to be let out of school in elementary. They gave us tickets. We were let out of school for a couple of days to attend the fair, and it was held on the Fairgrounds. And that's over, we're talking over off of 85 and the fairgrounds over there, and you would go in. They had rides and everything for the fairgrounds. We would go in, attend the fair, and they had a big roller coaster. It was a big white roller coaster before the Scream Machine, before all of that, the big white roller coaster, and we would ride on that and the other things, and then eventually they did a movie out there when they had closed that down, and Burt Reynolds, whatever movie that was, I think they used that in the movie and exploded the roller coaster. But that was a landmark. And if you were not here, if you were not born here, if you don't know anything about it, you wouldn't remember or you wouldn't know, because you would think that these studios for movies were always there. But that used to be the place we went every year for the fair. I say again, they would let us out of school, give us tickets to go to the fair. And so there's a history that goes with this city. The ATL is rich in history. Whether good or bad, it's rich in history. And those of you, I just thought I would take a moment to share some of the things that are here with colleges, the school, eating places, landmarks, churches, and I could have left some out. And if you're watching this and you watch it later, fill in the blanks and let us know some other places that churches that may have been gatekeepers in the city, where things were taking place and things would happen. While I'm talking, one came to mind: Wheat Street Baptist Church. I think the pastor during that time was Pastor Brothers, I believe, and he had a big church, basically almost downtown. And so you had a lot of gatekeepers in this city, those that watched over the city, prayed for the city in a spiritual way, those that were impactful in some of the political changes and the system of our city. And so the ATL is rich. And I know this is Black History Month, so I wanted to share with those of you that we're rich in history here in the ATL. It's not just Atlanta, it's not just the big city, but we're rich in history. And we see history still being made. We see people still coming. We see things still taking place. There's happening every day. And so when we understand our history, we can appreciate our city more. The more I see the changes and the things that are happening for good, I can appreciate it because I've been here all my life. When I say all my life, I've never lived in another city. I've never lived anywhere else. I've been here. I've seen it come from when the ATL was the most popular to now you've got places, Decatur, Conyers, you've got Lithonia and all these places, Fairburn, you've got College Park. These were the outskirts, and you heard about them, but you didn't hear about them. Now we become this big place, this big city, and so we understand that it has great history here. And I've been so blessed to be able to live in this city almost 60 years. If I get to live into November and see my next birthday, it'll be 60 years that I've stayed in the ATL in Atlanta, born and raised here, and seen such great history, seen historical events and things made, and seen some things go up, some things come down, some things built, some things that they tore down and replaced it with something or even with something better. But it's been a great history, and I believe it's going to continue to be great as we enjoy the ATL. Something must be going on with the ATL because it's crowded. Everybody looked like they're moving here. And I remember when we were back in the day, man, you could get on the highway and just drive, and you didn't have to worry about nothing. You could get wherever you're going now, and you got to sit in traffic. Everybody and their mama is here. Everybody has come to the ATL. Everybody is a part of the ATL. Everybody. I mean, it's just they're developing stuff and putting stuff everywhere. Everything is going on, and it's just amazing of the major changes and things that have happened. It's amazing of ministries and those that have come into the city that have made great impact while they're here. And so we're talking about from 1960 all the way up to 2020, what impact that the city, when it comes to Atlanta, one of the things I remember, and I'm going to be done, was I remember they were building the airport, and the late Mayor Maynard Jackson had a lot to do with that. They built, renamed the airport after him. And I remember the airport, when we had an airport, it was nice. But when they built the airport we've got now, I'll never forget, we were going to the old airport, and so we were getting ready to go somewhere. And where we were used to getting off to go to the old airport, they had closed that exit down, and the next exit was now the airport exit. And we'd heard about it, but when we got to the airport, it was such a major airport and big that where you used to could just walk to the gate, you couldn't walk to the gate no more. Now you had to take a train to get to the airport. It was that major, it was big. And so it took us a while to get used to going to that airport because it was a major change. It was a major thing that had taken place. And so we see these things today. We see the advancement of the city, but not only the advancement of the city, but I have to say we see the advancement of colored people, people of color. We have come a long way in this city from the 60s, believe that. And we've been blessed to be in places that most people probably thought we'd never be in, and to occupy offices and things and places that people thought we would never be. But God has blessed us to be there. And so I say to you, let's really appreciate our history. Let's really appreciate the ATL. Let's appreciate this great city that we live in. Listen, I don't know about you. Over the years, I've said to myself, there's only one or two other places I would live if I wasn't in the ATL. And only other place years ago, and I'm sure they built it up, that I used to travel. The only part about it I didn't like, it was just too hot there. I love Phoenix, Arizona. I just think Phoenix, during the day that I travel, the open space, waking up early in the morning, seeing the mountains and stuff, and seeing the snow on top of the mountains, I just thought Phoenix was a wonderful place. It was just too hot for me, but I thought it was a wonderful place. And if I was going to live anywhere, I would have lived in Phoenix. But the Lord has blessed me to live here, and so I'm grateful. Thank you so much for joining me. Just wanted to drop in on this last week of Black History and share some of the things that I remember about this great city and knowing the history of the ATL. May God bless you, and may all God's best be yours.